I'm Natalia Lobach, and this is Change Course on digital transformation. Digital transformation, technology transformation, it's really two words for the same thing. So if you're hearing both of those things, don't get too concerned. In the last episode, we talked about the 4 different types of org changes and how you set up your team for success from the perspective of leadership. And we got into a little bit about why functional leadership and change leadership are different, and they have different skills that go along with them. I'm going to save a breakdown of that for another episode, not today. But today we're going to talk about technology transformation and how does this differ from an org change. So, technology transformation, again, at its core, is really about taking some of your processes in the organization and putting them into a technology-enabled, automated, or a technology-driven environment. In the last decade or so, we've seen a lot of evolution in this area. So coming in with some of the original types of tools where you would be hosting on-premise large operating systems in order to drive major functions in your organization like finance, supply chain, human resources, etc. Now you're seeing that much of this stuff is now online. So now it's software as a service. So your organization is creating a partnership with an organization that provides the software, but the software doesn't live inside a server in your headquarters. Gone are the days when you would have to pay exorbitant fees to pay for the electricity for the air conditioners that were cooling off your server room. And I'm laughing because let me tell you, I've been at a couple of organizations that had rooms, huge amounts of real estate devoted to technology on premise. There are still a lot of places that do this, and there are lots of, there's reasons why that happens. But for the most part, you're looking at moving away from that type of environment. You're looking at hosting these types of services online. So instead of going and buying a package of software that, a few years ago would come on a disk, which you would put in your computer and upload or install, that doesn't really happen anymore. What you are now doing is that you're actually through your internet service provider or through digital services, you are actually putting all of this hosted online somewhere else, but in an environment that is constructed and catered specifically for you. What does that actually mean at a functional level? So when we're looking at technology transformation, we're also anchoring on the operating model, because the operating model is, importantly, how your organization delivers value and what functions are in your organization, how are they structured, and then how do they all work together. From that then flows your organizational structure. So the functions are broken down, who's in charge of each function, what are the roles and the specific work packages that are being done by the various roles that then fall into those functional areas. So the best way to visualize this is the box and line diagram that shows your organizational structure. This is always linked to your operating model and the organization's purpose and strategy. So technology, whatever you're bringing technology in to do, it is always going to be in a support role to make sure that your organization can deliver its function and its value more efficiently, more cost effectively, and faster, most likely. So remember those things: efficiency, cost effectiveness, and speed. A lot of what happens in organizations is that process should follow function and should follow value. But a lot of times, because we're human and humans are fallible, link back to a couple of my older episodes to hear some more about that. But we are all human. And so a lot of times process can become convoluted. We can put in controls and approvals into places that is not needed, just because we want to have oversight or control, or want to make sure that there is some governance around process. But what this can do is actually create a lot of noise around the pure organizational process that you need in order to deliver value. What a technology transformation does is it offers you an opportunity, really, to standardize your organizational process. Come on, you're not the only one out there doing what you're doing. There are so many other companies and organizations who are doing it just as well, maybe better, maybe sometimes worse than you. So there's a wealth of information to be learned here. And a lot of the companies that come with their technology they've done their work, they've done their research, because they want to provide a product that meets most often the standard in the industry. And so a lot of those standard processes are going to be baked into the technology tool that you are considering. What this does mean, though, is that you have an opportunity, and I'm saying this in a very positive way, but you have an opportunity to look at your process and decide what works and what doesn't. Because when you're moving your process into a technology supported, enabled, or driven environment, you don't have to do all the same things that you used to. I mean, for example, let's just think about how things used to work. What feels like a million years ago. Somebody would type up a memo, and I say type on a typewriter, type up a memo, and then it would be picked up and walked over to somebody else's desk to read and approve it. That doesn't need to happen anymore. You don't need to pick up the memo and walk it over. What you do have now is a technology-enabled approval process whereby you have notifications, you have people signing in and viewing something online, providing an electronic signature and an electronic approval to send that off into the next step in the process. So that's just a very small example of what that looks like. If you are a functional leader, this is what your job is in a technology transformation. Number one, understand your process. Number two, understand the points of the process that are driving value for the organization. And number three, what are the parts of the process that are creating, and I'll use a lean term here, but what are the parts of the process that are creating waste, that are redundant, that can be streamlined? You need to do some pretty serious introspection around controls and around approvals to make sure that you're not just putting them in for the sake of having, something to do. And I'm being a bit facetious here, but I often see a lot of controls and approvals that are put into place because of need for quality and need for accountability that you can actually build into a technology-driven process in different ways. So when you are looking at moving into that new technology-enabled environment, you're looking at those processes, you're looking at the governance, you're looking at the approvals, and you're figuring out what stays with us and what can go. That is the point of inflection of change for people in a technology transformation. It's about, one, learning and adopting new organizational process, and number two, figuring out how that means they have to do their job differently. And a lot of ways, this is not just about learning a new software system. This is more than that. This is about, how does my job actually change? What does my day-to-day actually look like? There's a story that really illustrates this well for me. I was working with a client on a technology adoption, and it was like, this was a big one. It was a bunch of functions, and one of the areas that we were bringing into this technology-enabled environment was their audit process. And so they had a health and safety function in this organization because it was a manufacturing organization. And so you had to have audit. It was really, really essential that you were running audits on a regular basis for the purposes of workplace safety and accountability in that environment, as well as for the integrity and the quality of the product that they were delivering. So health and safety was a very important process that was occurring. And this process was actually being run, and I've seen this in a lot of organizations. So this is not the first time, and it's certainly not the last, but they were running this entire process across a global company at, I would say, like over 60 manufacturing sites globally. They were running it off of a macro-enabled Excel workbook. Not the first time I've seen this, so this is not a judgment at all, and it's certainly not the last time I'm going to see this. I actually recently just finished with a client that was running pretty much their entire financial department off of an Excel spreadsheet. Pretty amazing stuff you can do with macros, I've got to say. Anyway, long story short, this process had limitations because when you are in the Excel environment, you can't run approvals. You can't run a technology-enabled approval process through that. And approval is a core important process for audit. Approval is central to the audit process. It is how audit drives value and prevents error and prevents catastrophic events that really impact people's lives. So you can't run an approval process in Excel. The technology that we brought in had a bunch of approval steps in it and did an amazing job of actually running things like approvals and reminders and deadlines and enforcement and accountability. Wow, pretty cool, right? So there was a health and safety manager that I was working with at one of the sites. I won't say where it was. I don't want to give it away. She was really, really fun to work with. And one of the things she told me was, as we were implementing this technology, before we implemented, we learned about her process. And she said, she was telling me, and I sat with her through, one of these exercises, and the bulk of her time was spent chasing down plant managers and approvers in the approval chain, and also people who were responsible for coming up with writing the reports on the corrective actions that were being taken for points of risk or failure in the audit. There's a lot of paperwork that goes along with that. It is absolutely necessary for regulatory. You've got to do this, and it's got to be right. She spent 80% of her time chasing down all of these audit approvals and paperwork delivery and approval. So the audit couldn't be closed until all of these pieces were together. All of the corrective actions, first of all, had been documented, the corrective action identified, the course of action had to be approved, then it had to go back through the chain again because it had to be implemented, then it had to be re-inspected, and it had to be reapproved. So if you can imagine, this was all paper-based, so you had one health and safety manager running around chasing this for everybody. What was amazing was after we implemented the technology, what she said to me was, I do not have to send one email. I do not have to run around with a folder of paper to get people to sign this off. I can now spend my time planning the next audit. I can now spend my time researching and looking for ways to better respond to corrective action. I can now spend my time looking at ways to improve some of the processes that we have in place. That really was how her value changed. So you can see how, in terms of the function was the same, but the process was now more efficient. You saw it being delivered faster. You saw less waste in the process itself. And you saw your health and safety manager enhancing the value that she was providing to the organization by really being able to stop, chasing people around for signatures and focus on what was really driving value and improvement and innovation for the organization. These are the little changes that we're talking about when we're talking about technology implementation. When we look at this example from the other side, what happened was everybody who was on that approval chain, instead of having this person show up at their office and say, knock, 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 you need to sign this piece of paper. What was happening now was they had to adopt a new way of working. The new way of working that they had to adopt was now they were using the technology to interface around, number one, the documentation, and number two, the approval process. So the way that they were interacting with the work changed. When I talk about training, this is where, when you're looking at an organization and a technology change, this is where broad-based training around functional area, this is where you're going to run those big, large training programs, right? This is where, for example, everyone who was part of that approval chain had to be trained on how to do the approvals. They had to be trained on how to get into and use the system. This is when we're talking about some of those other change methodologies out there in the world that you can, tap into if you want to. This is the kind of stuff where you need to train people before they can actually execute and actually change. What it came down to in this case was very specific training around how to execute something in technology versus somewhere else. And also putting incentives into the system. So for example, you couldn't have the health and safety manager running around and showing people how to use the system. We provided the training and the tools people could go back to. It was all self-led e-learning. We did some instructor-led, but then provided self-led micro-learning for people to be able, if they forgot how to sign into the system or they forgot to do something else. Then we also had incentives built in. So if a document was late or an approval was late, it had an escalation pathway. So first it would email your direct boss. Then it would email the unit director. Then it would email the vice president. And last of all, and most embarrassingly, it would email the CEO. And so this was actually incredibly effective at getting people to respond to their tasks inside the system and to figure out how to do it. This was not different than what happened previously. I want to be really clear about that. So there was an escalation pathway before, and there was escalation of the same nature that went all the way to the top if you missed your approval. But it was always seen as a point of negotiation because it was manual. So, for example, the escalation would go to the health and safety manager, and the health and safety manager would say, if you don't get the approval in, I'm going to have to escalate this as per our process to your direct boss or, to the CEO. Oh my goodness. But it was always seen as a point of negotiation. So people could say, oh, okay, yeah, just let me finish that. Please don't email them. Give me another hour and I'll do it. When we put it in the system, this was no longer a point of negotiation. It was a point of accountability. And it really changed the interactions and the way that people worked together. I would have to say in a positive way. The folks who agreed, the people who are on the receiving end of these things are also motivated to make sure that their sites are as safe and effective as possible. They want to make sure they're preventing workplace injury. They want to make sure they're delivering really high quality. They understand the value of the audit and how it fits in. And so they weren't opposed to this process. They actually bought in. And so it was really beautiful, actually, how they took on that accountability. Amazing. Anyway, long and the short of it is, that's really what I'm talking about when I'm talking about technology transformation, technology adoption. I told you a little adoption story here because it really highlights some of the key points that you're looking at when you're a functional leader in this instance. And when you're bringing technology in, and your role as a change leader is really around the functional leadership, making sure your processes are aligned with the new technology, and being able to help your team and help the people that are part of that new technology-enabled process to adopt and execute in that new environment. That's really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in these implementations. It's around changing the way that we work. And so learning and adoption and incentive are going to be at that point of inflection for technology transformation. You want to be looking at how you're actually using the system more efficiently than you were maybe doing those processes in the past. So in our next episode, we're going to break this down a little bit further and look at the stages of change and where you as a change leader are going to come in and impact and influence those. So I hope this was helpful. It gives you sort of that high-flying view of what this all looks like. And I look forward to sharing a little bit more about the change process with you in next week's episode. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, I invite you to like, share, rate, and subscribe because it helps others find us. Change Course is brought to you by Charthouse Advisory Services and ConnectedChange.com. Our music is Levity by Emily Clausen. Show notes have moved. We're now at ConnectedChange.com. So visit us there under the Change Course podcast page, and you'll find a list of all the resources that I've mentioned here today. While you're visiting us, sign up for the Change Navigator newsletter. You'll keep on top of all things change, and every month we are sharing exclusive content and resources only with our subscribers. So don't miss out. Sign up at ConnectedChange.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to change course.